event that tried to open an issue that has remained, well, to use President Aquino's statement, dormant. But in our way, in our view, it is an open-ended question. It is the recent expression of what we call the cycle of the Sabbath rain. Except that, in our days, compared to the old days, there is what I call reversal. Because in March 1968, just a month before I was born, and probably many of relatively young generations of my time, where did Japita massacre happen? And now in the 2013, we have relatively the same issue, but in the reverse form. In 1968, it was the government that wanted to take Sabah by force, but without the support of the Sultanate in its people. But now, it is the Sultanate, or at least a family of the Sultanate, that wanted to go back to its homeland, but was interpreted as an intrusion by Malaysia in the Philippines, and without the support of the Philippines. So in other words, in around 45 years, we have not gone that far. We only had the same cycle. We only had to go back to that period, critical period of our history. In a sense, I feel that there was simply a detour of our stuff after 45 years, that we had to return back to the same question. Hence, I would not simply look at this as a standout from a historical perspective, but I would like more specifically to highlight the implications of this issue, the moral struggles, including what I call RP-Malaysia relation. Also, its implications in regional security, including the geopolitics of big powers in Southeast Asia. What I mean is, in 1968, there was no US people, that is, the intent of the United States to come to Asia, particularly in Southeast Asia. There was no war on international terrorism, and there was no South China Sea dispute. But these three factors are now part of the contemporary history of Southeast Asia, and now the Sabah claim has, or issue has resurrected. I feel that we are totally different. Living in a totally different historical context. And I fully agree with the view of our Mufti that we live in a dangerous times. And this is probably the reason why we have to pool our resources together, sit together and engage in how we could at least help address, if not resolve, the issue. So I would like to organize my presentation at least these areas. A brief context of Southeast Asia, a very brief reading of Southeast Asia. What I call the Sulu-Sabah historical continuum. The implications, what are the possibilities in the trajectories of this project, and what are the options and the strategies, particularly the recourse to peaceful settlement as a method of resolving these questions. Let me go to the first to the next slide on brief context of what we call the Southeast Asia. In the old days, what we refer to as Southeast Asia is known as the Nusantara. And it previously lived in what I call self-regulated or contained region. There were empires and dynasties like the Majapahit in the Srivijaya, the Ayutthaya in southern Thailand, and so on and so forth. But it was very self-contained. In other words, it has its own dynamic. Why? Because Southeast Asia has been subjected to different layers of culture. Probably beginning with the Polynesia, Champa somewhere into China, then you have Funan in China, then later on the Hindu, the Buddhists, as they put up Srivijaya Empire and the Majapahit Empire. This was the old context of Southeast Asia before the advent of Islam in the region. Just the same, it was very local, it was very regional. There was no foreign interference. But the new picture happened when other missionaries began to arrive in many parts of India subcontinent, then later China, then downward to Southeast Asia, Southeast Philippines. So that the previously Hindu and Buddhist empires were converted. And the most prominent is the conversion to Islam of the Sultanate of Malacca. It is there accordingly where Islamization proceeded to many parts of Southeast Asia. And just a few years after the founding of the Brunei Sultanate, in around 13th century, then the Sulu Sultanate was formed in 1450, at least according to one source. The Maguindanao Sultanate was established in 1515, and later another Rajaship was formed in Manila, particularly the kingdom of Raja Suleiman. However, as we said, this is rather self-contained because it happened within the landscape of Asia, particularly in Southeast Asia. But the picture radically changed with what we call the advent of Western adventurism, beginning with the travel of Marco Polo in the 14th century, then which opened the East in Asia to the West. And that's also triggered the rivalry between Portugal and Spain. With the imprimatur of the Pope, the world was divided into two, part of which was under the influence of Portugal, the other one under the influence of Spain. Then, that began what we call the period of colonialism. And that also began the coming in of foreign powers, beginning with Portugal, with Spain, with Holland, the Dutch, with France, with Great Britain, with Germany, and Great Britain, and finally the United States. Incidentally, all these foreign colonial powers had entered into treaty relations with the Sultanate of Sulu. In a separate study, we were able to list the number of treaties entered into by foreign powers with the Sultanates of Sulu, the Sultanates of Maguindanao, and the Sultanates of Huayan. At least preliminarily, we had identified around 16 major treaties entered by different colonial powers with Portugal, with Spain, with France, with Great Britain, with the Sulu Sultanate, and around 14 or 15 also with the Maguindanao Sultanate, and 3 or 4 with the Huayan Sultanate. So this is how reads the engagement of the Sultanates in southern Philippines with foreign powers. And in fact, in the 1878 treaties, the list was there. It was rather a treaty entered into by Sultan Jamalul Al-Amin the latter days. There were many treaties entered earlier. So that the relationship between colonial powers and the Sultanate is that on one hand of resistance, of war, on the other hand of trade and diplomacy. This was the two major features of the engagements. But by around 18th century onward, we saw the birth of nation states. This is the phasing out of the imperial and dynastic system in Europe, in the birth of nationalism, starting with the French Revolution, and eventually the independence of the United States from Britain, followed by different countries in Europe, including Asia, and hence Southeast Asia. Hence, in the late 20th century, or even 19th century, we saw the rise or the rise of or the decline of the Ottoman Empire, then eventually the rise of the of Turkey, although by early 20th century the Caliphate was abolished and the new Turkish Republic was put in place. For purposes of brevity, the same also happened in many parts of the Muslim world when the sultanates were removed from power and new governments, generally secular governments, were put in place. And the birth of nation state, we would say, has tremendous impact in the sultanate, not only in Sulu, but even in Mindanao, in other parts of Southeast Asia. Why? Because we said there was a dilemma that developed. On one hand, the sultanate wanted to retain its control at least of certain power and territory, but with the institutions of the both, like the case of Malaysia and the Philippines, then there were many issues and questions that were not resolved, so that these were when colonial powers got out of Southeast Asia, so that the relationship between sultanates and existing, say, nation states in Southeast Asia became problematic. In many countries in Southeast Asia, for instance, like Brunei, because it accepted the rule or influence of the white Rajas, they embraced British colonialism, at least in the latter part. And eventually, power was handed to Brunei eventually. In the case of the Sulu Sultanate, it continuously fought against colonial powers, even if it in the treaties with Great Britain and in the United States in the latter part, it was already quite late. Because the project was that the Philippine nation state had to be formed and that the sovereignty of the Sultanate had to be transferred to the Philippines. In the case of Malaysia, the British had a project of creating a distinct nation state that later became the Federation of Malaysia. So this is the context, at least, of Southeast Asia, so we could at least appreciate why there is this recurrence of issue like the Sabah, the Sulu Sultanate in the Sabah claim. Next slide, please. To summarize the whole issue of the Sabah question, but the Secretariat of the Darul Ifta, including our student from UP, came up with a ABP or a video so that we could fully understand the timeline, at least the timeline of the Sabah question. So let us watch for a while the video. Last 2 Fridays, I was in Kuala Lumpur in University of Malaya,
And there are two lecturers in the panel, two
Malaysian academics and two from the University of the Philippines. We are one of them. And the two Malaysian academics are in fact are the veterans in the issue of Sabah claim. In fact, Professor Ranjit Singh was responsible for winning the case of Malaysia in the issue on Pulau Ikatan and Sipadan between Malaysia and Indonesia. So Malaysia won in that case. Of course, the presentations of the two academics, Malaysian academics, are such that there is no claim. There is no Philippine claim as far as their position is concerned. And the Philippine position, including legal luminaries that we mentioned there, former Ambassador Baha, Senator Miriam Santiago, and Dean Magallona, were consistent that indeed the Philippines has a strong claim in Sabah. And since we already provided the timeline, I think what we could do is highlight two major principles in the issue, well, apart from the subject on Pajak, whether it's session or lease. But two principles determine precisely the debate on the Sabah questions, and this is the principle of self-determinations and effectivities. Accordingly, the positions of Malaysia is that because North Borneo, since and in many instances were not really controlled by the Sulu Sultanate, including the foreign powers that used to control Sulu, is that the people in the area, including the referendum in 1963,
said that they already wanted to remain under Malaysia, and therefore the principle of determination accordingly is on their side. The other one is the principle of state authority, or what is in French referred to as effectivities, where Malaysia has the authority precisely in over North Borneo. But the contentions starting precisely during 1962. This is when Macapagal pursued the claim. And the subsequent Philippine administration from Marcos onward, although there were instances of different administration trying to drop the Sabah claim, is that the Philippines has a claim over North Borneo. And this is the same position by Filipino legal luminaries on the validity of Philippine claim in Sabah. Before we came, last Tuesday, we had a forum with Ambassador Baha in the university, and he was very consistent with the view that the Philippines has a claim. And he based his assertion on the positions of then Vice President Emmanuel Pilaes, also the Foreign Secretary at that time, including the group of Silonga that went to London to advance the claim of the Philippines. And of course, Miriam Defensor Santiago, being an international lawyer, just published her opinion in a major daily newspaper, and he said, indeed, the Philippines has a claim. And recently, we were also in the forum with Dean Merlin Magallona. In fact, he attended our forum at the Institute of Islamic, organized by the Institute of Islamic Studies, and he gave us his briefing, a very concise position on the validity of Philippine claim over Sabah. It's quite a short presentation, but we distributed this, and you can have this So you can have your time to read this. But in my view, this is the most concise presentations on the validity of Philippine claim over North Borneo. So probably I will not go into the discussions. Maybe our lawyers, our younger lawyers are here could help us explain some of the details of the positions of the Philippines over North Borneo. But what I want to emphasize is what really surfaced since the 60s until these days is the contrast between what I call the legal claim, the validity of our legal claims. In other words, the law is on our side, vis-a-vis the absence of political will, particularly from the Philippine governments in trying to relentlessly pursue the Sabah claim. Because there was and there is a continuing what I call erratic policy and discontinuity as far as Philippine administration position relative to the issue on Sabah. And we have seen this very glaringly these days with the reversal of positions by the Pinoy administrations over the Sabah claim. Despite that the early administration from Macapagal to Marcos and so on had relatively sympathetic positions as far as the claim is concerned. So that because of this erratic policy and the discontinuity of positions of the Philippines, the Sulu Sultanate has been what I call left in a state of suspended animation. In other words, it is left hanging, not knowing what to do, either to stick with the Philippine government or to withdraw its sovereignty that it has ceded and take history into its own hands. The Lahad Datu incident and probably the future into which RP-Malaysia relation would become is dictated by the state of the Sulu Sultanate. It has no position within the Philippine nation-state system. And this poses a dilemma to the Sultanate itself, including, in fact, to the Hamba Rakyat of the Sultan, particularly here in the Zamba Sulta area, and more specifically in the Sulu archipelago, including those in North Borneo. So let me proceed to highlight some of the implications of this question. I hope I still have a few minutes to. Thank you. Sabah issue is different from the Moro struggle or even from the peace process. But we consistently put forward our view that the Sabah issue in fact is a vital organ in the Moro struggle. You cannot divorce the two. Both are mutually inclusive. It means one is either part of another. You simply have to go back to 1968 and how it was so critical in the formation of the Moro National Liberation Front, and therefore also the formations of the succeeding Moro fronts, and including its impact in the peace process. So that to disconnect the two, in my view, is ahistorical. It's not historical to disconnect the two. It has no historical basis. However, if you connect the two, that is the Sabah claim and the Moro struggle, it will entangle, or the Moro struggle will be entangled in what I call the unwritten rule between Malaysia and the Philippines. And this is a view that I advanced in Kuala Lumpur 2 Fridays ago when I said that this unwritten rule between Malaysia and the Philippines define the direction of the Moro struggle. What is this unwritten rule? This is a realization between the two countries that the Muslims in the Philippines, particularly through their movements, could only be given certain space in Southern Philippines. A space that will make them contented, but not to a degree that they will gain freedom and independence. Because if they become independent, first is it would disintegrate the Philippine Republic. And second, it will redirect the Moro struggle to Malaysia. Hence, it's not in the interest of either the Philippines and Malaysia to fully support the struggle for self-determination, including the formation of an independent Bangsamoro state, because these are not in the interest of the two countries. So, this unwritten rule was realized after the Jabida massacre was bungled, the Operation Merdeka was bungled, and the massacre happened, so that the interest of the Philippines, or the intent of Marcos to grab Sabah by force, was redirected by Malaysia by organizing the Moro National Liberation Front to fight against the Philippine government. That's why I said that was a skill and expressions of diplomacy par excellence by Malaysia against Marcos. But somehow, somewhere, both countries realized that when the MNLF will gain independence, as I said, both interests will be affected. So by 1977, Marcos declared his intention to drop the Sabah claim. In response, Malaysia also reduced its assistance to the Moro National Liberation Front, leaving the MNLF to find allies in the Middle East, and so on and so forth. So that in the mid-70s, there began what I call the forging of relationship between Malaysia and the Philippines, and eventually the isolation of the MNLF from at least the politics between the two countries. So I said this unwritten rule dictates the direction, if not the tempo, of the Moro struggle. And in fact, I expanded our assertion, view that the same may also be replicated with the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, because the same unwritten rule applies, except that the difference is, of course, the MILF has no direct connection to the Sulu Sultanate, unlike, say, the Moro National Liberation Front. But the same dynamics will be operationalized by the two countries. That is why I said the problem presently is that when the government tried conspiracy against the Sulu Sultanate and probably even the MNLF and some Filipino politicians, I said that is a misreading of the situation, because I said the problem is basic. The failure of the government, the Philippine government, and the Malaysian government to accede to one simple rule. That is, do not put your eggs in one basket. By concentrating on the GPH MILF peace process, and protecting this as if this is the major and critical element in resolving the Moro struggle, there were other parts that were left, particularly the Sulu Sultanate and the Moro National Liberation Front, because the government did not put eggs into the basket in the Sulu archipelago. because so the result was there was an imbalanced policy, hence resurrecting the old issue of claim, including the feeling of betrayal by the Moro National Liberation Front, since it claimed that the MNLF has been engaged in the peace process with the Philippine government since 1976, 1987, in the 1996 peace agreement. But recently, the government is already hesitant to engage in the peace process with the Moro National Liberation Front. Why? Because, and this leads into the problem of the distribution of the eggs. This is my very brief presentations in Kuala Lumpur. Now, let me go into these security implications, the regional security implications of the discussions. I said that if the Sabah question is not resolved as early as possible, it will become what I said, the third red buttons that could be interchangeably pressed, like the United States, given that there are two existing red buttons in the region. This is the war on international terrorism and the South China Sea dispute. So I call, in fact, I advance a plea while there in Kuala Lumpur that parties concerned, that is Malaysia, the Philippine government, and the Sulu Sultanate, should resolve this problem as early as possible, because if it will not resolve so, then this can become potential red buttons that could be utilized by big powers in their attempt to control not only specific countries but even the whole of Southeast Asia, given the fact that 60% of the US Navy will now be transferred to Asia, and we feel that the next, that the core would be here in Southeast Asia. And personally, my reading is Sulu Archipelago, including the Sulu Sea, would now become the US, American lake. And therefore, if the Sabah question is not resolved, then it has the potential of becoming a trigger for regional tensions and conflict. Then the last part, the last discussions. Okay, what are the clarifying what they call traditional ways of resolving the issues in the creative ways? What we are seeing now is that the Philippines and Malaysia would like to perpetuate what I call the unwritten rule. It is strengthening its relationship. Both countries do not want to be affected by the crisis. It wants to promote status quo. But the impact of this hard position by the two governments, it will reconfigure the Moro struggle. In other words, it should change the character of the Moro struggle, probably a formations of alliance, even amongst enemies, would happen, and a strong tendency of the framework agreement, including the Bangsamoro political entity, as becoming the first casualty. We don't know if the postponement of the exploratory talks in Kuala Lumpur by President Aquino is a sign that there is a crack in the GPH-MILF peace process, and if that is so, then we'll have a problem not only in the Sulu Archipelago but even in Mindanao. And there will be instability in the Sulu area, in the Sulu zone. And although probably what the government will do is to reify or work with traditional politicians, and that is not in the interest of promoting democratizations in the area, and probably even making the third red button being um, easily realized. Now, what are the creative ways? I think the positions of the United Nations and its a call for humanitarian interventions and the call for peaceful dialogue and negotiation should be promoted, and we are just very happy that this forum fits into the call of UN Secretary General to promote peaceful dialogue and negotiations. I think another creative way is to promote what we call back-channel diplomacy. This is important because the problem with President Aquino is that he stood quite high and took a very strong position, so it would be difficult for him to take a different positions and come down and sort of change his statement, because it means he's not consistent. So he needs some kind of a face-saving mechanism so that he will not be embarrassed in front of in the country, in the world community, given that Malacanang is now isolated. Many Filipino nationalists, including the left, President Ramos, Senator Gordon, Vice President Gingona, Senator Pimentel, and many others are now calling for a talk between President Aquino and the Sultanate of Sulu. And many of our legal luminaries, as I said, are consistent with their view that there is a claim of the Philippines over North Borneo. It may not be 2 minutes. We may not be able to see a recourse to bringing the case to the International Court of Justice in either both short and long term, because Malaysia indeed would not want to bring the case to the ICJ. And there is no enough power that could compel Malaysia to accede and bring the case to the International Court of Justice. But I think an opening is available in terms of addressing the issue of proprietary claim. Since this was the subject of discussion between then Prime Minister Mahathir and President Ramos, they already sat together to sort of draw some plans on how proprietary claim be subject of review and possibly even increase. But this will not happen this time, because the clouds of war has to subside a little bit, and I think a very critical thing to do is the need for the Sultanate, all the heirs and claimants, to forge their ranks together and consolidate their unity. This is very, very important, because we ordinary individuals could just go that far. If the Sultanate does not refuse to be united, particularly the claimants and the heirs, then it would discourage individuals or personalities who would like precisely these problems be resolved. So again, we are not only calling for the two governments and the Sultanate to come together and talk and resolve this amicably, we also bring our plea to the heirs and the claimant that this is the time for them to close the ranks and be united, so that they can advance a single position when probably negotiation would happen in some future time. So peaceful settlement, this is the last part, and I think this is the claim of Miriam Santiago, United Nations plea for peaceful dialogue and negotiations. It has its own advantage because it is very tedious, but we just hope that it will be the directions. The statement of the President of Indonesia, President Bambang, is also very encouraging. He's also saying peaceful resolutions and dialogue. But I would like to highlight the Islamic principles of peacemaking and reconciliation in the field we call Shiyar, or Muslim international law in relation. This is an old subject. Of course, our ulama are very much familiar with this. in fiqh, but it has not given much articulations in different fields. Even in the OIC, while peaceful settlement is also recognized, like good offices, inquiry, mediations, but there's no strong body that promotes the idea of inquiry, mediations in the Muslim world. So this is where we need to rally together to engage our neighbors in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia and Malaysia. We would like to forge a network with the ulama in these countries so that they will also be informed of the gravity of this problem, and probably they would be the one to sort of also influence the respective governments to realize the need to resolve this problem peacefully. And finally, as part of our search for creative ways to resolve the problem, we need to develop what I call the human development framework in addressing the Sabah questions. And I feel we have to do this continuously because the legal niceties and complexities are difficult to resolve. There should be human development interventions, and this is where the role of the ulama is central in this whole exercise. Wa ba'd, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
ضد القول من المحامين والاشخاص المدعوين حول قضيه الاسامه. That's for the benefit of the ulama. First, the